The sharp chill of the night air clung to Sam Carter, a black boy with tightly coiled hair and deep brown eyes as he crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, his breath visible in the moonlight. His dark skin glistened faintly from the cold sweat beating on his face, and his heart thundered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Sam clutched his phone tightly, its cold surface slick with sweat from his trembling hands. Through a gap in the warped wooden planks, he peered into the warehouse ahead. What he saw made his stomach twist. Rows of men and women sat bound and gagged on the cold, dusty floor. Their eyes were wide with terror as armed guards paced between them, barking orders. Crates marked with strange symbols were being loaded onto trucks by burly men in dark clothing. The flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows, amplifying the scene's grim reality. "Move it! No mistakes!" a gruff voice barked. Sam leaned closer, his pulse quickening. Another man laughed darkly, adding, "The boss wants this cleaned up by dawn. No loose ends." Sam's instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't look away. Trembling, he activated his phone's camera, snapping photos of the captives and their captors. The images were shaky, but they were evidence, proof of something horrifying. He adjusted the angle, trying to capture the leader's face, when the floor beneath him groaned. The sound was faint, but it echoed like a gunshot in Sam's ears. One of the guards paused mid-step, his head snapping toward the noise. "Did you hear that?" he growled, his voice cutting through the air. Sam's breath hitched. His hands, slick with sweat, tightened around the phone. Without another thought, he turned and bolted into the woods. Branches clawed at his arms and the icy wind stung his face, but he kept running. Shouts erupted behind him, the heavy thud of boots growing louder. Sam's mind raced. He needed to escape. He needed to survive. The memories of his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "You're stronger than they think, baby. Don't ever let them break you." He clung to her wisdom, finding a sliver of strength in her voice. After what felt like an eternity, the faint glow of a streetlight appeared through the trees. Relief surged through him as he stumbled onto the main road, gasping for breath. His legs wobbled, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to find help, someone who could see the photos and stop what was happening. Sam didn't realize it yet, but this night would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Justice, betrayal, and survival were on the horizon, and he was at the center of it all. What would you do if faced with such a choice? Let us know in the comments, and stay with us as we uncover this story of courage and resilience. Sam stumbled onto the main road, gasping for breath and clutching his phone tightly. His coiled hair was matted with sweat, and his dark skin glistened under the glow of the streetlights. The images and sounds from the warehouse replayed in his mind. The terrified faces, the shouted orders, the threat of no loose ends. His legs ached, but he pushed forward, driven by the urgent need to find help. A faint glow appeared ahead, and his heart lifted as he spotted a patrol car parked under a streetlight. Relief surged through him as the door opened and a familiar figure stepped out. It was Officer Reed Barker, a respected figure in the community, and someone Sam had always trusted. "Officer Reed!" Sam called, his voice hoarse. He stumbled toward the car, waving his arms. Reed hurried over, concern etched across his face. "Sam? What's going on?" Reed asked, steadying the boy. His tone was calm, reassuring, but Sam noticed his eyes flicker toward the phone in his hand. "There's something at the old warehouse," Sam said in a rush, thrusting his phone toward Reed. "People are tied up. Guns, drugs. I took pictures. You have to see this." Reed took the phone, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through the images. For a moment, Sam felt a flicker of hope, but then something in Reed's demeanor changed. His jaw tightened and his eyes darkened with a cold, calculating edge. "You did the right thing bringing this to me," Reed said, his voice suddenly hollow. "I'll take care of it." Sam frowned, a strange unease settling over him. "Wait," he began, stepping back. "I can show you." Before he could finish, pain exploded at the back of his head. The world spun as Sam crumpled to the ground, darkness closing in. His last memory was of Reed standing over him, his expression devoid of emotion. When Sam stirred, he was lying face down on cold, damp earth. His head throbbed, and his body felt heavy. Through his blurred vision, he saw a figure crouch nearby. It was Reed. Sam's chest tightened with fear as he realized what was happening. "You should have kept your nose out of this, kid," Reed muttered, patting Sam's pockets. He retrieved the phone and smashed it against a rock, the glass shattering with a sharp crack. Satisfied, Reed dragged Sam toward the edge of a ditch. Gravel scraped against Sam's skin as he was rolled onto his side. "Stay down," Reed said coldly before disappearing into the shadows. The night dragged on, cold and silent. Sam drifted in and out of consciousness, the ache in his head dulling into a numb haze. When dawn finally broke, the faint sound of footsteps pulled him from the edge of unconsciousness. A jogger, out for his morning run, froze at the sight of Sam lying motionless in the ditch. "Oh my God," the man whispered, pulling out his phone. "There's a kid here. He's hurt. He's not moving." Within minutes, sirens pierced the air as paramedics arrived. Their voices were urgent as they worked to stabilize Sam, their movements quick and efficient. "We've got a pulse," one of them said. "Let's move." They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the nearest hospital. The jogger stood by, shaken, as the ambulance sped away. Laura Carter arrived at the hospital an hour later, her face pale with worry. She barely registered the words of the doctor who explained Sam's injuries. All she saw was her son, his smooth, dark skin marred with bruises and his head wrapped in bandages. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched his hand. "What happened to my boy?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Who did this?" Officer Reed arrived shortly after, his uniform crisp and his expression carefully composed. "It looks like a mugging," he said solemnly. "We're investigating every lead." Laura stared at him, her grief-stricken eyes searching his face. Something about his tone felt rehearsed, too polished, but she couldn't pinpoint why. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that justice would be served. But a strange unease gnawed at her. As Reed left the room, Laura turned back to Sam, her grip on his hand tightening. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice firm despite her tears. "I'll find out who did this to you, I promise." The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines keeping Sam stable. Laura sat by his bedside, her fingers gripping his hand tightly. She couldn't stop staring at his pale face, his coiled hair matted against the bandage wrapped around his head, and the faint bruises on his deep brown skin. Her mind replayed the doctor's words. "He's stable but unconscious. We can't predict when or if he'll wake up." It was a cruel uncertainty she wasn't prepared to endure. The news of Sam's attack spread quickly through their small community. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers flooded the hospital with casseroles, flowers, and cards. Laura appreciated the gestures, but each one felt like a hollow echo of comfort. None of it could answer the burning question in her mind. Who had done this to her son, and why? Officer Reed Barker became a regular presence at the hospital, his polished demeanor a source of comfort to many. To everyone else, he was a symbol of justice, a man tirelessly working to find the person responsible. But to Laura, something about him felt off. His tone was too calm, too rehearsed, and his sympathetic smiles never reached his eyes. "We'll investigate every lead, Mrs. Carter," Reed assured her during one of his visits. "This was likely a random mugging, but we won't stop until we find the perpetrator." Laura forced a nod, biting back the surge of anger rising within her. She wanted to trust him, but her instincts screamed that he was hiding something. The thought gnawed at her, refusing to be silenced. Days turned into a blur of hospital visits, restless nights, and unanswered questions. Laura decided she couldn't just sit and wait for answers. She began piecing together the timeline of the night Sam was attacked. He had left his friend's house shortly after sunset, a familiar route that should have taken no more than 20 minutes. But hours had passed before he was found unconscious in a ditch. Where had he been during that time? Determined, Laura retraced Sam's steps. She started at the corner store he often stopped at, speaking to the clerk who remembered seeing him that evening. "He bought a soda and left," the man said. "He didn't seem upset or in a hurry." Her next stop was the jogging path near the ditch where Sam was found. She approached a jogger who had been in the area that night. "I remember seeing a patrol car near there," the man said hesitantly, "but I didn't think much of it at the time." When Laura pressed for details, the jogger grew uneasy. I really don't know anything else, he muttered before walking away quickly. Frustration and unease bubbled within Laura as she made her way to the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Sam had mentioned it once or twice in passing, but it had always been a distant, forgotten structure. When she arrived, the building was eerily silent. The air smelled faintly of bleach, and inside the floors were spotless. Too spotless. Every trace of what had happened there had been meticulously erased. Her heart sank. Whoever was responsible for Sam's attack knew how to cover their tracks. Back at the hospital, Laura found Reed sitting in the waiting room, chatting with a nurse. His presence immediately set her on edge. He greeted her with a warm smile, but it felt like a mask. "How's Sam doing today?" he asked, his tone dripping with practiced sympathy. "The same as before," Laura replied curtly. "No change." Reed nodded, his expression carefully composed. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Carter. I promise you." Laura wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but she held her tongue. If her growing suspicions were correct, confronting Reed directly would be dangerous. Instead, she channeled her frustration into quiet determination. She began speaking to people in town, asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual near the warehouse. The responses were mixed. Some offered quiet support, murmuring encouragement. Others dismissed her as a grieving mother grasping at straws. But the most unnerving reactions came from those who avoided her altogether, their nervous glances suggesting they knew more than they were willing to admit. Meanwhile, Reed's carefully constructed image as the town's protector began to show cracks. Behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly to erase his involvement. The night after Sam's attack, he and his men cleared out the warehouse, relocating the captives and transporting the drugs to another state. By morning, the building was empty, its walls stripped of any evidence. Reed also made subtle moves to silence potential witnesses. He visited the jogger who had reported seeing Sam near the ditch, leaning against the man's car as he spoke in a low, measured tone. "You don't want to get involved in something like this," Reed said. "It's better for everyone if you keep quiet." Back at the hospital, Laura sat by Sam's bedside, her mind racing. She thought about the jogger's hesitant words, the warehouse's unnatural cleanliness, and Reed's too perfect demeanor. The pieces didn't fit, but her instincts told her she was onto something. As she brushed Sam's hair back gently, she whispered, "I'll find out what happened to you, Sam. I promise." As if in response, Sam's fingers twitched. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was the faintest movement, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope. "Sam," she whispered, leaning closer, "can you hear me?" Though he didn't stir again, the small sign of life strengthened Laura's resolve. She would uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. The hospital room was dim, the only sound the steady beeping of the machines keeping Sam stable. Laura sat by his side, holding his hand tightly. Despite the faint flicker of hope she'd felt when his fingers twitched the day before, Sam remained unconscious. She brushed a strand of his coiled hair from his forehead and whispered, "You're going to pull through, sweetheart. You have to." Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A nurse stepped in, her expression hesitant. "Mrs. Carter, there's a call for you. It's Mayor Langston." Laura stood quickly, her heart pounding as she took the phone. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for calling." "Laura, I just heard about Sam," Langston said, his tone heavy with concern. "How is he?" "He's stable," she replied, struggling to keep her composure. "But he hasn't woken up yet. Robert, I don't think this was a random mugging. I think something much bigger is going on." There was a pause on the other end. Finally, Langston spoke, his tone cautious but serious. "What makes you say that?" Laura hesitated, her grip tightening on the phone. "I've been digging into what happened that night. Sam saw something. Something dangerous. I think Officer Reed knows more than he's letting on." Langston's silence was telling. After a long moment, he said, "If you're right, we can't take any chances. I'll contact the FBI. They need to step in." Relief washed over Laura, and she exhaled shakily. "Thank you, Robert. I just want the truth." The following day, Special Agent Hannah Pierce arrived at the hospital. With her sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, she immediately took charge. "Mrs. Carter," she said, extending a hand, "I'm here to protect your son and get to the bottom of this." "Thank you," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. I've been so scared. You have every right to be, Pierce replied. But from this moment forward, no one gets near Sam without my team's clearance. We'll make sure he's safe. While Pierce's presence brought some comfort, Laura's anxiety remained. Every shadow in the hallway felt menacing, every unfamiliar face a potential threat. Outside Sam's room were a small consolation, but they couldn't quiet the storm of fear in her mind. Pierce began piecing together the fragments of information Laura had collected. She reviewed Sam's movements on the night of the attack, the jogger's account of a patrol car near the ditch, and even Mark Carter's old case files. What she found painted a chilling picture. Mark was investigating a trafficking ring, Pierce explained, her voice low and grim, and he suspected someone on the inside was involved. Laura's heart sank. Are you saying Reed? It's a strong possibility, Pierce said. Your husband's notes hinted at it, and now with what Sam saw, we have enough to dig deeper. Laura clenched her fists. If Reed's responsible for my husband's death and my son's attack, I want him brought to justice. Pierce nodded. We're working on it. My team is reviewing Reed's phone records and financial transactions. If he's involved, we'll find the proof. Meanwhile, Reed was growing increasingly paranoid. The night after the warehouse raid, he worked to erase his tracks, relocating captives and destroying evidence. He moved with desperation, knowing the walls were closing in. At the hospital, Sam stirred again. Laura rushed to his side, her heart racing as his eyelids fluttered open. Sam, can you hear me? Mom, he croaked, his voice weak but audible. Tears of relief streamed down Laura's face. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. Sam's brows furrowed as flashes of memory returned. It was Reed, he whispered. He hit me, took my phone, left me in a ditch. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. Are you sure, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Sam nodded weakly. He's part of it, Mom. He's working with them. Pierce entered the room moments later, her expression sharp as Sam recounted the events. This is critical information, she said, but we need to keep it quiet. If Reed finds out Sam is awake and talking, he might try to silence him again. Laura's grip on Sam's hand tightened. You can't let that happen. You have to protect him. I will, Pierce assured her. We're increasing security. No one gets in or out without my approval. As Sam began to recover, his memories trickled back in fragments. One evening he turned to Laura, his voice hesitant. Mom, do you think Dad knew about Reed? Laura's heart clenched. I think he suspected, she said, her voice trembling, but he didn't want to put us in danger. Pierce worked tirelessly, reviewing Mark's case files and the FBI's findings. Among the documents, she discovered damning evidence, a list of arrests that had been quietly dismissed, all tied to Reed's precinct. One entry stood out. Reed knows I'm getting close. He's nervous. Pierce shared her findings with Laura. Your husband wasn't just killed in the line of duty, she said carefully. He was silenced. Laura's world tilted as the weight of the revelation hit her. Mark had sacrificed everything to uncover the truth, and now it was up to her and Sam to see his work completed. We'll make them pay, she said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. We will, Pierce replied, her tone firm. Together. The sky was still cloaked in darkness as the FBI's tactical units gathered near the outskirts of a sprawling industrial district. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its hulking silhouette barely visible against the faint glow of distant city lights. Special Agent Hannah Pierce stood at the front of the staging area, her voice low but firm as she addressed her team. This is it, she said, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of the agents before her. We've confirmed this is the syndicate's new base of operations. Inside, we have hostages, illegal goods, and key members of the operation. Our mission is clear. Secure the hostages, gather evidence, and take them down. The team nodded silently, their focus razor sharp. Every step had been meticulously planned, every movement rehearsed. Timing was critical, and the element of surprise was their greatest weapon. The tactical units moved into position, their black uniforms blending seamlessly with the shadows. Pierce monitored the operation from a mobile command center nearby, her earpiece crackling with updates as agents took up positions around the perimeter of the warehouse. She glanced at her watch, her fingers tapping nervously against the table. The air was thick with tension, the quiet before the storm. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was chaotic. Men barked orders as crates were loaded onto trucks, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. Captives sat huddled on the floor, their hands bound and their faces pale with fear. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, accompanied by the occasional clatter of metal against concrete. "Move faster," one man growled. "The boss wants this shipment gone before sunrise." Pierce's voice came over the radio. "Team Alpha, go." At her signal, the first team breached the main entrance. The heavy metal doors slammed open with a deafening crash, and agents flooded the room, their weapons raised. "FBI, get on the ground!" they shouted, their voices cutting through the chaos. Pandemonium erupted. The traffickers scrambled to react, some reaching for weapons while others bolted for the exits. The captives screamed, their cries blending with the shouts of agents and the heavy footsteps echoing through the warehouse. Pierce, leading the second team, entered through a side door. Her sharp gaze swept the room, quickly assessing the situation. Captives were scattered across the floor, guarded by armed men who now fumbled to regroup. "Secure the hostages!" she barked. Agents moved swiftly, cutting restraints and escorting the captives to safety. One young girl clung to an agent's arm, her small frame shaking. "They said they'd make us disappear," she sobbed. "Please don't let them take us." "You're safe now," the agent reassured her. "No one will hurt you again." As the agents cleared the room, another team uncovered a hidden storage area filled with crates of drugs, firearms, and stacks of cash. Ledgers and documents lay scattered across a desk, the evidence tying the operation together. Pierce picked up one of the ledgers, her expression hardening. "This is it," she said. "This is the proof we need." Suddenly, a voice crackled over the radio. "We've got movement. Officer Reed Barker spotted heading south." Pierce's heart sank. "Seal the exits," she ordered, but it was too late. Reed, using his intimate knowledge of the warehouse's layout, had slipped through a side exit. Outside, tire tracks in the dirt showed where he had fled in a waiting vehicle. Frustration surged through Pierce as she relayed instructions to her team. "Set up roadblocks. Alert local units. We can't let him get far." Back inside, the operation continued. Agents meticulously cataloged the evidence, ensuring every piece would hold up in court. The captives were escorted outside, where paramedics waited to assess their injuries. The young girl, still trembling, gave a chilling account of her ordeal. "The man you're looking for," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was in charge. He gave the orders." Pierce knelt beside her, her tone gentle but resolute. "You're very brave for speaking up. We're going to make sure he never hurts anyone again." As dawn began to break, casting its golden light over the scene, the scale of the operation became clear. The warehouse was a hub for trafficking people, drugs, and weapons, and the evidence gathered would be enough to dismantle the syndicate. But Reed's escape left a bitter taste. He was the linchpin, and his capture was crucial to ensuring justice. At the FBI field office later that morning, Pierce debriefed her team. "We've delivered a significant blow to their operation," she said, her tone measured despite the fatigue in her eyes. "But this isn't over. Reed is on the run, and desperate people make mistakes. We need to stay ahead of him." She turned to Agent Daniels, her second in command. "Increase surveillance on his known associates. If he reaches out to anyone, I want to know immediately." "Danny," she toned. Daniels nodded, already making notes. "Understood." Meanwhile, Laura and Sam had been relocated to a secure location, away from the danger and the media frenzy. The separation from the action was difficult for Laura, but she understood the necessity. As the hours passed, she found herself replaying Mark's warnings from before his death, his subtle hints that something big was brewing. Sam, still recovering, spent the evening sketching what he remembered from the warehouse. His hands trembled as he drew, but his determination was unshaken. "They have to stop him, Mom," he said quietly. "For Dad." "They will," Laura replied, her voice steady. "For all of us." Back at the scene of the raid, the final pieces of evidence were being packed up. Ledgers, weapons, and communication devices were loaded into evidence bags, each one a link in the chain of Reed's corruption. Despite the success of the operation, Pierce couldn't shake the lingering frustration of Reed's escape. "He's desperate now," she told Daniels during a quiet moment. And that makes him dangerous, but it also means he'll slip up. As the sun rose higher, the warehouse stood as a stark reminder of the horrors it had concealed. The captives, now free, were on their way to safety, their lives forever changed. And while the fight wasn't over, the team knew they were one step closer to justice. The secluded cabin deep in Pinewood Forest stood eerily quiet under the cover of darkness. Inside, Officer Reed Barker paced the small living room, his mind racing. His plan had unraveled faster than he could contain it, and now the FBI was closing in. He clenched his fists, his thoughts consumed by desperation and fury. In the corner of the room sat a young girl, her hands bound and her face streaked with tears. She had been one of the captives from the warehouse raid, someone Reed had intended to use as leverage before his operation crumbled. Now she was his last bargaining chip, his insurance policy to negotiate an escape. "You stay quiet," Reed growled, pointing a finger at her. "They don't care about you, but they'll listen to me if they want you back alive." The girl whimpered, shrinking into the chair. Reed's pacing grew more frantic as he glanced at the handgun resting on the table. Every shadow outside the window looked like an approaching figure. He knew his time was running out. Miles away in the FBI's mobile command center, Special Agent Hannah Pierce reviewed the latest satellite images of the cabin. The heat signatures inside confirmed Reed wasn't alone. Pierce's expression hardened as she turned to her team. "We move in fast and precise," she said. "Our priority is securing the hostage and bringing Reed in alive." The tactical units assembled silently, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Pierce led the convoy of unmarked vehicles through the forest, their headlights off to maintain the element of surprise. The air was thick with tension as the team approached the cabin, each step bringing them closer to the confrontation. Pierce stopped the team just outside the clearing, holding up a hand for silence. She stepped forward, her megaphone in hand. "Reed Barker, this is the FBI." Her voice rang out, firm and commanding. "We know you're inside. Let the girl go, and we can talk." Inside, Reed froze. His eyes darted to the girl, then to the gun. "You don't call the shots," he shouted back, his voice shaking. "I do. If you come any closer, she's done." Pierce remained calm, signaling her team to hold position. "Hurting her won't help you, Reed," she said. "You're out of options. Let her go, and we'll listen to what you have to say." Reed laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're up against." Pierce exchanged a look with Agent Daniels, who nodded. The team moved into position, silently circling the cabin. Pierce kept Reed distracted, her voice steady and measured. "This doesn't have to end badly. You can still walk out of this alive." Reed's patience was wearing thin. He paced near the window, his grip on the gun tightening. "I want a car," he barked. "Unmarked, full tank of gas, no tracking devices. You've got 10 minutes or she's done." Pierce nodded slightly, giving the signal. A flashbang detonated at the rear of the cabin, the deafening explosion of light and sound throwing Reed off balance. He stumbled, shielding his eyes as the tactical units breached the front and back doors simultaneously. "Drop the weapon!" one agent shouted, their rifles trained on Reed. Disoriented, he raised the gun, but before he could aim, an agent tackled him to the ground. The weapon clattered out of his hand, and within seconds, Reed was restrained, his wrists locked in handcuffs. The young girl screamed as the chaos unfolded, but an agent quickly untied her and carried her to safety. She clung to the agent's neck, her small frame trembling. "It's okay," the agent murmured. "You're safe now." Outside, Pierce watched as Reed was dragged out of the cabin, his face contorted with rage. His eyes locked on hers and he spat bitterly. "You think this changes anything?" "You can't stop it. There's always someone else." Pierce stepped closer, her expression cold. "Not today, Reed." The girl, now seated in an FBI vehicle, recounted her ordeal to Pierce in a soft, trembling voice. "He said he'd make me disappear," she whispered, "that no one would find me." Pierce knelt beside her, her voice gentle but firm. "No one will hurt you again. You're safe now, and we're going to make sure he never hurts anyone else." As dawn broke over the forest, the tactical team secured the cabin, collecting evidence that Reed had hastily packed for his escape. Maps, burner phones, and bundles of cash painted a clear picture of his plans. Despite the satisfaction of his capture, Pierce couldn't shake the frustration of how close he had come to slipping away. Back at the mobile command center, Pierce debriefed her team. "This was a win," she said, her tone measured. "We've got Reed, the hostage is safe, and we've dismantled his operation. But we're not done. The syndicate is bigger than him, and we need to keep digging." Agent Daniels nodded. "Reed's desperate moves gave us leads. If he was panicking, he might have left something behind." Pierce's gaze drifted to the cabin's silhouette fading in the distance. "We'll find it," she said quietly, "and we'll finish this." Reed sat in the back of an FBI transport van, his wrists cuffed and his eyes fixed on the floor. The defiance he had shown earlier was fading, replaced by the realization that his empire had crumbled. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he had nowhere to run. The courthouse buzzed with quiet tension as reporters filled the steps outside, their cameras clicking in rapid succession. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The trial of Officer Reed Barker had drawn national attention, the fall of a once respected law enforcement officer now at the center of a web of corruption, betrayal, and exploitation. Reed sat at the defendant's table, his expression a mask of stoic defiance. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he still carried an air of confidence, as if convinced his reputation might shield him from the consequences of his actions. But as the courtroom doors opened, his composure faltered. Sam Carter walked in, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized suit he wore. His coiled hair had been neatly styled, and his deep brown skin bore faint scars from the attack. His mother, Laura, stood at his side, her face set in a determined expression. As they took their seats, Reed's jaw tightened. The boy he thought he had silenced was not only alive but ready to testify against him. The judge entered and the room fell silent. After the formalities were completed, the prosecutor called their first witness, Sam Carter. Sam stepped up to the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Laura gave him an encouraging nod from the gallery, and he took a deep breath before speaking. "I was walking home the night it happened," he began. "I saw something at the old warehouse. People tied up, men with guns, crates with strange markings. I took pictures on my phone and ran to find help." The prosecutor nodded. "What happened next, Sam?" "I saw Officer Reed's patrol car," Sam said, his voice steady despite the weight of the memory. "I thought he would help me. I told him everything and showed him the pictures. But instead, he hit me, took my phone, and left me in a ditch." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reed shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer rising quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation." "Overruled," the judge said firmly. "Let the witness continue." Sam described the terror of that night in vivid detail. The betrayal, the fear, and the desperation to survive. His words painted a damning picture, and by the time he finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of his testimony sinking in. The prosecutor introduced Sam's photos, recovered from a cloud backup, as evidence. The images displayed rows of captives, armed guards, and crates marked with coded symbols. The room was transfixed as each photo appeared on the screen, a stark reminder of the horrors that had unfolded. Next, Special Agent Hannah Pierce took the stand. Her testimony was precise and methodical, outlining the results of the FBI investigation. Reed Barker was not just complicit, she stated. He was integral to the operation, coordinating shipments, laundering money, and ensuring the operation remained hidden. The survivors' testimonies followed, each one adding to the mountain of evidence. A young girl rescued during the raid spoke in a trembling voice. "He was in charge," she said, pointing to Reed. "He decided who stayed and who disappeared. He told us no one would ever find us." Reed's lawyer attempted to discredit the witnesses, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records revealed suspicious deposits, phone logs linked Reed to known traffickers, and the ledgers recovered from the warehouse tied him directly to the operation. His defense crumbled under the weight of the truth. Among the most powerful moments of the trial was the introduction of Mark Carter's personal notes. One entry read, "Reed knows I'm getting close. He's nervous." The prosecutor connected the dots, explaining how Mark's investigation into the trafficking ring had made him a target. "Mark Carter was murdered because he refused to look the other way," the prosecutor concluded. And Reed Barker ensured his silence. Laura sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the evidence about her husband's death. Sam reached over and took her hand, his grip firm. They exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain and determination. The defense's closing arguments were desperate, painting Reed as a victim of circumstance who had been coerced into his actions. But the prosecution's response was unyielding. Reed Barker betrayed the badge he swore to honor, the prosecutor said. He exploited his position to harm the very people he was meant to protect. Justice demands accountability. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood. On the charges of conspiracy, corruption, human trafficking, and the murder of Officer Mark Carter, we find the defendant, Reed Barker, guilty on all counts. Relief washed over Laura and Sam as the words sank in. Laura closed her eyes, a quiet sob escaping her lips. Sam sat still, his expression a mix of pride and grief. Justice had been served, but the cost had been immeasurable. The judge addressed Reed, her tone sharp and unyielding. Your betrayal of the public trust is a grave offense. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Reed was led away in handcuffs, he cast one last look at Laura and Sam, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. Sam met his gaze unflinching. For the first time, Reed seemed to realize the depth of his failure. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited. Cameras flashed as Laura and Sam emerged, flanked by Agent Pierce and her team. Laura raised a hand to silence the questions. We're not here for attention, she said firmly. We're here because justice matters. My husband gave his life for the truth, and my son risked everything to carry on that fight. Today we honor their courage. Pierce placed a hand on Sam's shoulder as they stepped away from the throng. You were incredible in there, she said. Your testimony made all the difference. Sam shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I just told the truth. And sometimes, Pierce replied, that's the bravest thing you can do. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Laura and Sam walked away from the courthouse, their steps lighter. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were winning. The sun hung low in the sky as Laura and Sam Carter made their way through the peaceful cemetery. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the path, their shadows stretching long across the ground. In Sam's hand was a small bouquet of wildflowers, freshly picked from the field behind their house. They stopped at Mark Carter's grave, its polished surface reflecting the fading sunlight. Laura knelt down, placing the flowers gently at the base of the headstone. Etched into the smooth granite were the words, Mark Carter, a hero remembered. She traced the letters with her fingers, her chest tightening with a mix of grief and pride. Sam stood quietly beside her, his gaze fixed on the headstone. After a moment, he asked, Do you think Dad knew how much we loved him? Laura looked up at him, her eyes glistening. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly, rising to her feet and placing her hands on his shoulders. Your dad knew every single day how much we loved him. That love is what kept him going, even when things were hard. Sam nodded, his face a mix of sadness and determination. I just wish he was still here. I do too, Laura said, pulling him into a hug. But you know what? I see so much of him in you. His strength, his courage, his kindness. He'd be so proud of the young man you're becoming. They stood there for a while, sharing memories of Mark. Laura spoke of his unyielding commitment to justice, his sense of humor, and the little moments that had made their family whole. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sam smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried a flicker of hope. Later that day, the two of them took a walk in the park. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, their carefree joy a reminder of the innocence Mark had fought to protect. Do you think things will ever feel normal again? Sam asked, kicking at a pebble on the path. Laura considered the question, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. I think normal is different now, she said honestly. But that doesn't mean we can't find happiness again. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting your dad. It means honoring him by living the kind of life he'd want for us. Sam looked thoughtful, his brow furrowed. I think I understand, he said finally. It's not about pretending nothing happened. It's about remembering him and still finding a way to be happy. That's right, Laura said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. And as long as we hold on to his memory, he'll always be with us. They reached a bench overlooking the lake, its surface shimmering in the golden light of the setting sun. Sitting side by side, they watched the ripples dance across the water, the quiet serenity of the moment offering a small measure of peace. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "I know he would be," she said firmly. "He'd be proud of how strong you've been, how much you've fought to do what's right, and he'd be proud of us for sticking together." Sam leaned into her, his small frame fitting perfectly against her side. "I hope so." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Laura felt a sense of quiet resolve. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, but they had endured. Together, they would honor Mark's memory by living fully, embracing the moments of joy and peace that lay ahead. When they finally rose to leave, the path ahead seemed a little brighter. The glow of their home came into view as they walked, its warmth a promise of new beginnings. For the first time in months, they felt at peace, not because the pain was gone, but because they had found the strength to carry it. As they reached their front door, Sam paused and looked up at Laura. "I miss him every day," he said quietly. "I do too," Laura replied, her voice soft but steady. "And that's okay. Missing him means he's still with us. And as long as we remember him, he always will be." Together they stepped inside, closing the door behind them. The house was filled with the faint hum of normalcy, a sign that life was slowly finding its rhythm again. Laura glanced at a framed photo of Mark on the mantel and smiled. They had survived, and they would keep moving forward, carrying his legacy with them. Mark Carter's memory lived on in the strength and love of his family, a legacy of courage and resilience that would guide them for years to come.